Thank you so much, guys. Let's give them another round of applause, because they didn't really get one there, and they've all flown in from somewhere to be here with you today and to speak to me. So we have Julien, Stuart in the middle, Tariq there at the end. That's right, take a sip, because we're going to be talking a lot in this debate, this panel. So look, I had that little moment there where I took that straw poll and, you know, 0 hands when people were asked, do you want your money to be invested in fossil fuel-based projects? Quite understandable. A lot of us in this room have kids, we think about the future. But according to these 3 gents on stage, we're being told a lot of lies, maybe, about sustainable investing, ESG finance, okay? That means different things to different people. First of all, I want to ask each one of you, how should we understand ESG finance? Julien, let's start with you.
Well, we should probably understand it in terms of things that are real and material and things that matter. So, unlike Stuart and Tariq, you know, the approach that my organisation, Market Forces, brings is the advocacy organisation. We're the campaigners. We get up each day and we advocate for financial institutions to redirect finance and investment away from activities that damage the environment. And obviously, climate change is a primary concern. We are at the point where all major energy scenarios are looking at 1.5 degree global warming limits or net zero by 2050. They all point to the need to stop expanding the scale of the fossil fuel industry, which is separate from the transition, just not making it worse in the first instance. And economics are on our side. It's now cheaper to build renewables than fossil fuel for power generation in just about every country on Earth, so that's a good thing. But if you look at the business strategies of many of the world's large energy companies, we're seeing companies that are putting online new coal power plants, new gas power plants, coal mines, oil and gas fields, gas liquefaction facilities, all of which, and the companies know this, by the way, they assess these projects against scenarios where we have 3, 4 or more degrees of global warming. This is their business strategy. And you will see the names of these companies, whether it's Chevron, ConocoPhillips, GE, Mitsubishi, Marubeni, these names pop up on the indices that you'll see put together by BlackRock or MSCI, who I know are doing workshops. So please go and attend those workshops and ask them how companies that are expanding fossil fuels get called climate leaders or ESG leaders or green or responsible or sustainable. This is what's going on. And it is just one of a number of ways in which the asset management industry is absolutely failing to take responsibility for the companies and the industries that it owns. We're talking about institutional investors, an asset management community or industry that is riddled with apathy, incompetence, and cowardice, and is failing to be held accountable and to take accountability for the investments that it manages. To our peril in the short term as climate risk begins to manifest on the balance sheets of companies. And obviously, if we're talking about the moral dimension of finance, we're taking ourselves past the point of being able to keep global warming under control. That's what it's all about. So there's an opening gambit for you. You know, this is just one way in which we're being sold snake oil instead of seeing real material action and change driving companies whose business strategies are put together in alignment with scenarios where we abjectly fail to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
ESG finance, snake oil. Okay, that is a major opening gambit. Stuart, I'm going to ask you to pick up from there. You stood up in front of your former employer and you went for it. You said what you felt needed to be said. Tell us what's wrong with our understanding of ESG finance.
Thanks, Manisha, and it's always nice to be told that you're incompetent and callous by your first speaker. Tariq and I worked in asset management all of our lives, but I do agree with a lot of what he's saying. For me, I think there are 3 fundamental problems with ESG, at least in my industry and in finance in general. The first is around basically mis-selling. Let's call it what it is. We are selling products and services that either A, we don't do what we say we do behind the scenes, or B, they don't do what they say they do. So they have very little impact, and most people would be buying them expecting a certain thing to happen, and they don't. So there's a mis-selling element to this, and I think that's going to erupt in time. The second is proportionality. Our industry spent hours and hours every day looking at elements of ESG in the investment process when perhaps we should have been looking at tech earnings or interest rates or inflation or GDP growth. Markets have fallen 25% this year. I suspect we only talked about these points a fraction of what we did around diversity and ESG and green and climate. I'm not saying those latter things aren't important, but there's a proportionality issue here as well. And the third thing is a sort of cognitive dissonance or an internal inconsistency around the way finance looks at ESG. On the one hand, I'm told that I'm part of the family at a bank and they look after me and my mental health and diversity matters and we really care about you, and then they fire 20% of you as soon as earnings fall 20%. So I think they don't walk the talk a lot as well. So those are the three buckets of problems that I would prioritize.
Okay, as you're all managing together, we're going to have some pretty fiery conversations on this stage today. Brilliant stuff. Tariq, so for those of you who don't know, Tariq has written a series of blogs, which I think were quite forthright, really, really well written, really interesting, and give us great food for thought. Same question, really. What's wrong with our understanding of ESG finance today?
I think at its core, ESG finance doesn't change incentives. It in fact distracts us from the fact that we haven't. So the easiest way to think about the fallacies of ESG investing, just to add to what the other two speakers said, would be to add to the question that you were asked at the beginning. How many of you want to be invested in fossil fuel? No one really puts up their hand. The reality is, though, there's a question that comes before that for every single person. It's, do you want to receive the most return possible, or do you want to concede some return and end up giving away money you could be making in your portfolio? The answer is, in reality, pretty much no one says they want to give up any return. And even to the extent they do, it almost doesn't matter, because the majority of the capital in the economy globally is controlled by people who are spending money on other people's behalf, right? This is fundamental to the principal agent problem in capitalism. And so when someone else is managing your money, they have what's called a fiduciary duty to focus on value, measured objectively in dollars, and not values, right? Which may be important to you personally, but you maybe don't want your banker making a decision on trade-offs on energy and worker compensation and other things. And so the challenge with ESG finance is that it's sort of created this idea that there's this tons of money to do good things, right? So, if we give you the ability to invest in green stuff, you're going to do it. In reality, the return isn't actually there because we have not changed the incentives of the system. And at the core of that for climate change is the idea of a market failure. Right? It's the idea that people are able to pollute but not pay the cost of that pollution. Obviously, there is a cost that will be paid by young, poor, darker-skinned people, billions of them here in Asia, but we're not really talking about that. And so the market failure stays uncorrected, and you have a system where governed by fiduciary duty, and the capital flows more towards activities that are harmful than it ought to because we haven't put in place, the kind of regulation. And so at its core, I'd say ESG finance, you should separate it into two categories of things. Ingredients that could be used correctly, and then where they're being combined today in ways that don't help us. What are useful are, first of all, the human capital, right? There's tons of largely young people who are really passionate about this. I'm sure many in this room. That's great, right? You have a lot of brains you can work with. You have increasing data, right, to understand and measure these things. You have tools to help companies understand their carbon footprint. You have standardization of the data reporting. These are all great ingredients. But today they're being combined into products that imply that they have real-world impact that doesn't actually exist, right? The majority are public markets funds that just, it's a price segmentation strategy to take your basket of passive shares and give a green version so you could sell it to progressives. And if people are paying attention in the US now, the right is trying to, they want anti-ESG, so they can, it's again a price segmentation strategy. So the products are challenging and the narratives are probably the most challenging because they're effectively free market self-corrects theories by another name. And so that's why in the last 5 years, we've seen every single year ESG assets increase, ESG tools increase, disclosure increases, and somehow it increases alongside carbon emissions and inequality. Because we actually haven't changed the one thing that changed the behavior in the financial system, which is to actually affect people's incentives.
So, Tariq, before we delve into the solutions and how things can change and how people in this audience can help, and what we're going to get out of something like the FinTech Festival to drive this agenda of fixing what's wrong, I'm quite curious to understand from you, because you've written this series of blogs, people in here might say, you had a great career with BlackRock. What triggered you to turn your back on something like that and write what you wrote and now be in the position that you're in?
It was really the fact that I'd already left the industry about 10 years ago. I left the industry. It was a personal passion project and started focusing on education, which is Rumie. It was driven by the fact that my business school roommate here and actually in Singapore at INSEAD passed away of cancer, and it was a personal decision to leave the industry. I went back to the industry because there was this idea that, hey, you've done all this for-profit investing. I was a vulture investor, right? So pretty aggressive style. Then you've done this stuff with purpose. You can do both at the same time. And the reality is, when I went into the middle of the machine, this is the largest, I'm a trained investor, and this is the largest investment firm in capitalism and in history. It was a complete misrepresentation of what was actually happening. The reality is that there are solutions that can address the climate crisis. And one of the key ideas in that paper, The Secret Diary of a Sustainable Investor, that went viral, was to compare capitalism and competitive markets to competitive sports. And the reason I did that was to remind people that sports have referees, right? If the game gets dirty and people are kicking each other in the face, you don't have to rely on good sportsmanship forever. At some point, you call in the referees. They give out a few red cards. It changes incentives. And what's fascinating is our societal experts have a clear consensus that it's going to require systemic regulations from government to flatten the emissions curve. Just as unsurprisingly, epidemiologists told us that flattening the systemic COVID curve was going to require uncomfortable government intervention, closing schools, restricting travel. But it worked, right? And it's the same idea for capitalism and fighting climate change, but we have not implemented them because there's a clutter of misinformation out there. That is, and ESG at its worst is at the center of that misinformation. It's not a serious answer from the business community to dire human and environmental problems. It's actually masquerading as a serious answer when in fact it's just generally a little bit like what the tobacco companies did in the 50s, right, or fossil fuel companies had done for years, which is to muddy the waters so that the societal response is slower. It's clearly not in the public interest, but it is in their short-term interests, and we should expect that that's how they'll operate. That's how capitalism works.
So let's bring the conversation back this way. Stuart, let's pick up with you in the middle there. You are in the communications business. You have been for a long time. Tariq has indicated that there is this problem with how we communicate around this subject. What do you think can be done? Is anything being done? I'm thinking about the response to you standing up and saying what you did, your subsequent writing since then, and your commentary. Is it making a difference? Are more people standing up for the moral aspect of this conversation?
Around communication, I think there are two issues. One is the right or the ability to question things like ESG and other topics without losing your job or without fear or favor. And the other communication problem is widely talked about, and I wrote about this in the FT, is that ESG and sustainable finance suffers from an inability to define terms clearly. ESG means different things to different people. And indeed, your first question to us, what does ESG finance mean? How do you define finance? How do you define investing? And I've often mentioned the fact that there's a big difference between investing in the sense of you giving real money to a company or you withdrawing capital from a company and trading. Secondary market trading. And most of us spend our lives, we call it investing, but we actually just trade in shares or credits. For every buyer, there's a seller. And so at the beginning, when you were all asked, would you like to invest in a fossil fuel company? Imagine you are the market. You can't all put your hand up. Technically, only half of you can put your hand up because those who want to sell have to sell it to somebody else who can buy it. You can't all put your hand up. And so defining what we mean by financing and investing is crucially important. So I think all this activity, for example, that we do in the secondary markets, like in equities, underweighting certain equities, overweighting others, is complete nonsense. That's just a shifting around of who owns the piece of paper. Real financing is the actual giving and taking of the money. And one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here at a FinTech festival is because predominantly the FinTech industry is involved in direct funding to companies and disintermediating other firms that just shift pieces of paper round and round.
Yeah, if anybody loves your work, Stuart loves your work. So I know that you're willing to engage as well while you're here and talk to people about how you push the agenda. Julien, let me bring it back to you. So in sort of all the background reading around our conversation, I started looking into ESG ratings and how actually it's all really messed up. It's all really confused. You know, one rating is this for one and it's different for B, you know? So I looked up a definition. This came up in the Harvard Business Review, and it cited a Bloomberg article, actually, just to cite one and another. ESG ratings don't measure a company's impact on the earth and society. In fact, they gauge the opposite, the potential impact of the world on the company and its shareholders. And I think this comes back to Tariq's earlier point, is actually, if it doesn't boil down to returns, it doesn't really matter. How do you campaign against a world that has been going in that direction? It's like going against the flow of a river.
By bringing accountability to organizations that are hell-bent on pursuing business strategies and new projects that they know and we know are consistent with runaway climate change. So whether that's board members, whether that's through shareholders, whether that's through staff, whether that's through clients or customers, a lot of people care. Like, one thing that's in our favor is that people are generally concerned about climate change, want to see action taken, and while we are all susceptible to marketing, we would rather be told the truth, and we would rather be able to have greenwashed pierced through so we can really see what's going on. And this is the kind of stuff that we fight against, and when we're successful, we create change. A great example last year, we facilitated a shareholder proposal at Sumitomo Corporation. They've been proposing to build new coal power plants throughout South and Southeast Asia, fiercely contested by local communities. But those power stations were on track to proceed, and the shareholder resolution that we filed, it only got 20% of the vote, largely because the 80% of investors that didn't vote for it are the ones that I categorized earlier as incompetent, apathetic, or cowardly. But you don't need that much of a push from investors and a push in the public sphere to get a company to make small changes for them, for a diversified company, but significant for climate change and the environment. Sumitomo subsequently changed its policy. It's committed to not building new coal power plants, and the one that it was left in Bangladesh, subsequently it withdrew from, and that power station is no longer a proposal. So there's hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 saved right there. So it's through accountability and pressure, and people just not being willing to absorb and consume the marketing. I think that's something that we all agree upon here, is that you really need to challenge these institutions. And I also agree with Stuart. I mean, this is an industry ripe for the shaking up. It's incredible to think about, you know, companies that are incumbents and dominant now. BlackRock, for instance, it manages something, what is it, 10 trillion under management at the moment? It's about 35 years old. Eric Lim was up here before saying we got 28 years to transform the economy. It should be exciting to know that there are companies that will play a significant role in the decarbonisation that probably don't even exist yet. Or maybe they've just been founded, or maybe they're here at the Singapore FinTech Festival with their first stall right at the back near the food hall, and they just need to speak to the right people to get going. You know, change can happen very quickly if you're prepared to focus on real meaningful change and goals and outcomes. So that's the bit that we're doing, but there's no one silver bullet. We need everyone pushing in the same direction.
On a very positive note, I mean, it's conference season here in Singapore, and at the beginning of the season, I was attending a conference in which I heard some very important people on the stage saying, it's not that the technology doesn't exist, it does. It's just a question of scale. So how do we make sure that financing is going to those projects that can scale up fast?
I wouldn't say it's just a question of scale. It is, but it's more than that. It's a question of intent. So I'll use the example of Bangladesh again. This is a country that the tariff for renewable energy is something like 7 to 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Cheaper than coal, about 5 times cheaper than gas, running on imported gas, which is exactly what's proposed for another 30 gigawatts, which, if that's a foreign term to you, it's essentially enough new imported gas capacity proposed in Bangladesh to double the country's power capacity. This is at a time when Bangladesh can barely afford, if at all, to purchase the LNG that is now becoming entrenched upon. Why would a country do something like this? Well, if you look at Bangladesh and who writes the power sector master plan, it's JICA. JICA is the Japanese public financing organization. Well, it's the Japanese government. Who has the ear of the Japanese government? Itochu, Mitsubishi, Marubeni, all the big trading houses. What are they good at doing? Well, they're very good at trading oil and gas and building gas turbines. So what do we expect is going to be in these power sector master plans? We're having a false conversation about the way to transition and the way to build energy in Asia that is actually denying people the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of clean and cheap renewable energy now because it suits the interests of a few large trading houses and manufacturers of power equipment. They just want to bleed these business lines as long as they possibly can get away with it. We've seen that with coal and now we're seeing it with gas. And we need to treat these companies and their plans with contempt and ridicule and deny them that capital. And we need to shake that up right now. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. We're not going to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, and we can throw all of our modelling and scenarios out the window.
I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, because there are some who would say we can abandon them or we can engage with them and we can educate and we can progress. But then you might say to me, well, we don't have the time for that. But let's come back to this subject, definitely. Stuart, I want to take it to you. We've had some questions on Slido. And so we've had somebody pick up on your point around secondary markets. So there is a distinction between the impact of primary and secondary markets in driving change quickly. How can secondary market participants do better?
There's only one way. So selling your share makes absolutely no difference. As I've said, there's always a buyer, and there's no correlation between volume of trading and share prices, despite what people think. Look it up. There are lots of academic papers. The only way is through engagement and voting your shares. So if you hold stock in public equities, the only way you can drive meaningful change and impact, and what Tariq's called additionality, is by forcing companies to change via voting, either doing it directly yourselves or compelling your asset manager or wealth representative to do so. That is the only way. Of course, there are minute things around the edges around IPOs, in secondary markets, and in something like credit, for example, where obviously the debt has to turn over, clearly companies have to come back to the markets. But IPOs, for example, in the S&P 500 only account for about 1% of the overall market cap. It's almost irrelevant. So the only way you can drive change with your bog standard equity portfolios is not buying or selling, it's not overweighting and underweighting, it's voting your shares. And you don't need many of them, as engine number 1 proved with Exxon.
Thank you for addressing that question. I've got another question from Slido. This one I'm going to put to you, Tariq. The question is, industry signing up and committing $130 trillion to the cause, necessarily a bad thing? What needs to be fixed to channel money where it's needed? And we sort of had this conversation backstage.
So the 130 trillion, I assume, is a reference to GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It's funny it's mentioned because it seems to be unraveling in the press publicly in the last few weeks if you follow it. But you know, GFANZ, I would argue that it's probably more harmful than helpful. And the reason I'll say that is that there's far too many announcements of best efforts, things based on voluntary initiatives that simply will not work when you actually get to the execution stage, because it's not the way to make the most money and everyone's constrained by fiduciary duty. And so, you know, you could say that these are better than nothing because, hey, at least we tried. I would argue that actually it's the opposite. It's a waste of time, and it's a waste of time for a crisis that is not a collective mistake. I mean, there's this nonsense that like, oh, we're all messing this up and the polar bears are going to suffer. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as a bit of a heist, right? Because the longer we delay, we don't just amplify the costs, but they get transferred to the youngest people in the world, the poorest people in the world, the darkest skinned people in the world. So on some level, some of these initiatives, I would look at them with a more skeptical eye, because often they seem to be PR oriented and there's no particular reason to believe that they would actually succeed in any meaningful form. And the most interesting thing about it is that actually the solutions we need aren't ones we don't know, right? A guy won a Nobel Prize in 2018 for saying we should have a carbon tax based on economic theories that are 100 years old. The most fascinating thing about that is that that gets implemented through government, right? 4 American companies I'll give you an example of. Boeing, Disney, Netflix, and BlackRock. All 4 of them have put out ESG and PR statements on like whatever they feel like voluntarily disclosing that they're doing, you know, for the world, the nice stuff, the CSR stuff. All 4 of those companies face shareholder resolutions from their own shareholders asking them to disclose their political spending, which after 2010 and the Citizens United decision in the US is effectively traceless and limitless, all 4 of them fought off those resolutions. If you translate that into sports, it would be like a basketball player after the game, in a game that everyone knows is dirty, saying, here's what I want to do, and then giving a few PR talking points. And then someone asks, hey, by the way, I heard you're paying the rest behind the scenes. And they say, yeah, I don't really feel like talking about that, and they leave. There's no way to view that as anything but disingenuous, right? And so the challenge with a lot of these voluntary initiatives, Net Zero 2050, when Larry Fink is 100 years old, you know, a whole bunch of things like that, they're actually happening at the same time as these damn companies doing it are actually slowing the government's response. That kind of hypocrisy doesn't just endanger the planet, it also destroys the political foundations of capitalism. So one of the things I do now is, Rumie is a nonprofit. It effectively is, you know, micro-learning for young people, and it seems to be replacing social media. I went from 0 to millions of people in the pandemic. It's all open and free, but what's super interesting is I did a session with young people who were actual users, 90% of the users under 29. And I said my piece on ESG, and then someone said, hey, that's why capitalism doesn't work. And I said, wait a second, that's not what I said. And then someone says, all companies lie. And I said, wait a second. And you look at the data, the majority of millennials and Gen Z don't believe in capitalism anymore. We may all debate, like, do they even know what capitalism is? But the fact of the matter is, young people in Greta Thunberg's generation are seeing the leaders of capitalism today saying that this is the biggest issue. We should all, humanity, come together, and then every single year, you know, the IPCC puts out a report card and we're failing. And so I think at some point, what I would say to this audience is, besides building the tools that the world needs, right, ones that actually create impact, not ones that cover the fact that no impact is being created. And the senior people in this room in different industries, they know the difference. Besides doing that, I think there needs to be a counter-narrative. There needs to be a voice of Asian capitalism that is long-term, that actually tries to serve the public interest, and gets us out of a scenario where today the most dominant voices in capitalism are coming out of New York. And I submit to you that future generations that look back in excruciating digital detail at how humanity messed this up and passed certain tipping points will not look charitably on our answer if we said, oh, no, don't worry, we left it to the speed at which New York bankers asked for regulation, right? Like, after, you know, based on what happened in the financial crisis, we have to build a counter-narrative that is actually more responsible, and often that's going to require the government to make changes that are systemic, right, that are not just individual, because the biggest challenge is, as we saw the pandemic, you can't flatten a curve by, you know, focusing on good people doing the right thing. Will be defined by the speed of the laggards, not the leaders. So these need to be systemic reforms.
Tariq, thank you so much for that. There's so much there for us to consider. And, you know, there are regulators in the room. It's going to be interesting to see how those dialogues go from here. We don't have enough. I wish we had another 10, 15 minutes. We don't. I want to quickly get to 2 more questions at least. This one, okay, I'm going to be provocative. Let's do this. Julien. China and India are dependent on fuel like coal, and they can't survive without that. Europe was exploring coal. Australian coal mines, not a secret. Why ESG drama then?
India is one of the best success stories we know of when it comes to renewables. You're getting solar tariffs in India of something like 1.5 to 2 cents now. That's staggering. You know, this is where the change is being led. So, you know, when I first started doing this work, one of the phrases I kept hearing from the asset management industry was past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future performance. So this question, it's quite correct. There's still a lot of coal in energy systems. There's a transition that we need to make. Everyone here recognizes that. That's fine. We need to stop making the problem worse, and then we need to deal with that transition. And in fact, behind that question is a very important consideration, because there are a number of communities and individuals that stand to be winners and losers. And there's a lot of coal and gas dependent communities right now that are not being supported, that don't have governments going in and coming up with packages for skills development, industrial development that's going to be sustainable and compatible with the decarbonised economy. So I think one of the ways in which we all agree here is that the government's interventions at this point are minimal, they're lacking, and there's a huge amount of room for governments to come in and actually drive the transition. And this is one of the ways that we need to see it impacted. ESG as a drama, I think, is one of the most facile, most meaningless dramas that we're currently seeing. It's not a drama series that it really commands much attention when the manifestation of ESG is in the form of sustainability-linked bonds that gives everyone a great big green tick and doesn't actually move the needle. You know, going beyond ESG, we just need to look at real change, real solutions that we need to implement. So I think it's a great question, but it acknowledges that we need to make that transition very quickly.
Okay, in danger of never being invited back to the FinTech Festival, I'm going to steal one more question from each of you in just a couple of sentences, if you don't mind. I'll start at the end with you, Tariq, and work my way down. And it really is this. What is your call to action for the FinTech community that you'll be meeting this week?
I'd say two things. First of all, when you're building solutions in the ESG space, understand that exactly as Stuart said, there's an extraordinary opportunity to build new tools. But we have to self-police ourselves about the fact that there's no greenwashing there, because we can't wait for regulators to move. They need to move, but in the meantime, build stuff that has real impact. I think most people know the difference between, telling companies to talk and understanding that are they actually walking the walk. The second thing is to have a voice in this debate, because this is a fundamental debate on how the business community responds to giant societal problems. And right now, there's a narrative that's dominating the system that is extremely dangerous, and I think it needs a counter voice, and I think people in this room have an extraordinary role to play in that.
Thank you. Stuart, what's your call to action?
I'm going to change the one that I suggested before because it's already been mentioned. But the one thing I would say is most of your businesses are small, startup, growing, some are bigger than others. Not every company can solve every single issue on the planet. There are politicians to do it, there are scientists, there are bodies, there are organizations like Julien's. Don't expect to solve absolutely every single ESG. Make your company as good as it can possibly be. There'll be others, you'll be generating revenue, you'll be employing people who can do things. This idea that a payments company needs to solve a polar bear's problem is ridiculous. Of course we're all interconnected, but also try and create the best company you can and help the transition tangentially, and don't feel guilty about not providing every solution to every problem.
Thank you for that, Stuart. I think that's great advice. Finally, Julien.
I'd agree with all of that, and I'd just summarize it by saying we need to do what we can with what we have, where we are. The marketplace of 2030, 2040 that is actively decarbonizing will not have time or patience or support for anyone that's trying to pull the wool over consumers' eyes. And I think we can build businesses today that are fit for purpose for that decarbonized economy. And I think many of the people that are going to be part of that economy exist here in this room are going to drive the change in their own way. So to endorse what Stuart said, we need everyone working at their bit of the puzzle as hard as they can, and keeping their mission in clear focus. And if we do that, I expect that we'll see an enormous amount of disruption of the incumbents as well, and give them, if I can be a little bit provocative with my language, a big kick up the bum. Okay. How's that?
What a moment to end our conversation on. Look, I just want to say I really appreciate your time, all three of you, and also the fact that you've all fought a tide, really, to be sitting here and talking about all of this today. Thank you all so much. And in our appreciation that they're doing that on our collective behalf, a round of applause for my three panelists.